Our movie begins inside an institution where Nick heads to visit his mother. When they go into his mother's room, she doesn't acknowledge their presence, and the orderly leaves Nick to speak with his mother. Nick does his best to have her look at him, but when she does, she says that he looks like someone else. Nick isn't very happy about this, and he calls her out on lying about not knowing who his father was. He confronts her to get some answers, but when he touches her, they both get a vision of her in flames. This scares his mother, and she remembers that she's supposed to tell him about his father on this day specifically. She warns that his father is coming for him. Nick rushes out of the hospital, and he meets his friend Ryan by the car. Ryan tries to see what would make Nick feel better, and they decide to go for a drink or two. While Nick waits for another drink, a woman, Eve, pops up with some boyfriend trouble, and Nick tries to see if he could help at all. Eve ends up coming over to Nick's table, where he and some friends are celebrating his birthday. Eve seems to be making Nick's day better, but one of the guys asks Nick to do his thing. Nick decides to give them what they want, and he gives them the rules on his special power, which is the ability to see how someone is going to die. He goes around the table until he finds someone that's going to die in a way that's bad enough for him to sense, and it ends up being Brian. Nick sees that he'll die by stepping on a mine while in the service, and Brian tries to get him to answer him when he asks what he saw. Nick is more fascinated by the fact that he doesn't see anything bad when he holds Eve's hand. Meanwhile, Lillian lays in bed while something travels through the vents. When she goes to the vent to talk to the voice, it's Nick's father, and he's furious that she didn't tell Nick about him. Then, Lillian is set on fire, and Nick's vision comes true. Back at Nick's place, he lays in bed with Eve, and he tells her that his past is full of misery. Suddenly, Ryan bursts in and tells Nick about the news coverage of his mother's facility. After 8 months, Nick goes to see the judge, and he finds out that there was a lawsuit pending against the institution that housed his mother. He also finds out about his mother's will, and it turns out to be a folder full of papers. After Nick leaves, the judge talks to the vet and mentions that Nick has already found what someone is looking for. When Nick gets home, we find that Eve and him are expecting a baby, and he pulls Ryan into the living room to show a connection to a picture of a house his mother left him. It turns out that this mysterious house that he's been drawing since he was a kid is a house that his mother left him the deed to. The three of them head back to a small town to look for the house, and they go into a cafe. Once inside, they find a picture of the house, and Lucky talks about how the house is supposedly the only thing to survive a terrible flood that washed away a nearby town. Legend has it that the house was washed down the river, but no one can find it. When Nick and the others leave, they almost end up running over Sam, who is with Chris, and Lilith with surveying equipment. Nick tells them about his search for the house called Wormwood, and Chris tells him to follow him. Before they leave, Nick grabs a hold of Sam, and he sees his death by axe. All 6 of them drive down a country road, and Chris shows them a piece of a house that washed through a valley. Nick reaches out to Chris, and he finds that he's going to die a tragic death too. Next, they decide to go for a hike in order to find a house that might have washed through the area. Eventually, Ryan spots Wormwood, and Sam thinks something is very wrong here. Join the club. Just then, a voice calls out and tells them to walk away. A man walks out, and he makes sure they know that he's been taking care of Wormwood forever. His name is Seth, and he gives them one final warning. But Nick asks if he knows anything about the man that lived there 20-something years ago. Seth refuses to tell him anything, but eventually, he agrees to only let Nick inside. Nick walks inside, and Seth shuts the door behind them. Nick hears scurrying behind the walls, but Seth wants to point out that his deed is worthless here. He lets him know that this house was blamed for the devastation that came with the flood, and he's been trying to tear the house down for years. Meanwhile, Ryan spots men with axes surrounding them, and Seth throws Nick out. As Nick and the others run back towards the car, Seth sends the axemen after them. After a chase, Sam is hit with an axe, and Nick's vision comes true as Seth appears to finish him off. Finally, Nick, Ryan, and Chris make it back to the cars, and they tell the girls to get into the van. They start to drive off just as the Axemen appear, but Chris isn't stopping. Chris rushes them back to the town where they find that everyone is gone. But actually, everyone is still there. It just looks like a ghost town from their side. But Lucky can see them still. He heads to the back room, and he tells the man in the vent that he'll find a way to get Nick back to the house. As Nick and the others keep going down the highway, they try to figure out what Seth is hiding in the house. Just then, Chris swerves off the road to miss Lucky working on his truck, and they slam into a tree at the bottom of the hill. When they look at where they ended up, they find that they're right back at Wormwood. Chris says this isn't possible since they've been driving in the opposite direction, but when he investigates the property, he finds that it's identical to the place they just fled. After getting Eve out of the van, all of them head inside Wormwood, but she is extremely uncomfortable with staying there. When Nick pulls Eve to the side to talk, he pulls up to find multiple bodies hanging from the tree that stopped the house. Eve doesn't see what he does, but when he touches her baby bump in the tree, he convulses uncontrollably and burns a handprint into the wood. When Ryan pulls him off, Nick gets a vision of a brutal death, and they all head inside to wait for Nick to wake up. Ryan leaves Eve with Nick, and he rushes to the van with Lilith to gather supplies. While there, they hear a rustling in the woods, and Lilith decides that this is a great time to get it on. Seth and the Axemen appear in the woods, but Seth sends them to the house instead. Inside the house, Nick wakes up and decides to explore the house and sounds. It turns out to be a part of his dream, but when he's snatched, he wakes up in the real world. Outside, Lilith and Ryan show up with the supplies, and Nick comes outside to confront Ryan to see why he smells like what happened in the van. Suddenly, Eve tells them to hurry inside, and they find that there's something big inside the walls that lead to a vent. After trying to find the source, they hit a bulge that pops up behind a tapestry, and it pops wide open. Later, Nick lays down to rest, and he is woken up by the sound of his mother calling him from the vent. Lillian tells him to open the door to the cellar, and she shows him that she was what they hid behind the tapestry. This all turns out to be part of a dream, and Nick wakes up to go open the cellar door. Just then, Chris pops up, and he helps Nick pry the door open. As they work on the door, a line of Axemen get ready to charge the house, and Ryan rushes inside. After some trial and error, Nick realizes that the cellar door seems to trigger the Axemen, but if they leave it be, they don't respond. They sneak right by the Axemen, and they make a break for the van. While running, Nick falls down a hill, and he tries to draw their attention. As Nick and Ryan make their way through the woods, they come across Sam's decaying body, and they find out that Sam wasn't actually human Sam at all. Apparently, Sam was actually an angel of hell, and it turns out that Seth knew about this all along. Ryan continues his search, and he finds that Lilith is also a demon that steals unborn babies. After hearing this, they rush back to help Eve, but Lilith is already trying to get the baby. Suddenly, Seth takes out Lilith with his axe, and he explains himself to Eve. He also explains that Chris is a demon as well, and Nick is the spawn of Satan. Back at the house, Nick finds out about Chris, and he finds out that Seth and the Axemen are actually angels. Just after Chris tells him to go talk to his father, an all-out brawl between angels and demons breaks out. In the morning, Eve runs into Ryan, and she convinces him to get back to the house to help Nick. They find bodies littering the ground, and Eve pushes inside. They find Nick laying on the floor, and he screams as he comes to. When he stands up, we see that he has an axe in his back, and he tells them that he let his father out of the cellar. Nick collected 20 hearts overnight, and he tells Eve that he just needs 3 more. He starts by taking Ryan's heart, and after that, he comes for Eve, who runs out of the house. She runs right into someone outside, and she wakes up in a hospital. She finds out that she went into labor and had her baby, and the nurse brings in her baby boy. The nurse then goes to retrieve Seth from the hallway, and time passes. Years later, Eve assures someone on the phone that the house will never be found, but we see that her son has started drawing the house. The thought that was put into this story is great, and the suspense is palpable. And that wraps up this recap. Thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this recap, please subscribe with notifications turned on so you don't miss a single video.